Part three. Yeah. Okay, so welcome. This is part three of the BGA FRTOL course 2023-2024. And today we're going to be talking about these things. So we're going to have a look at some of the topics that came up in part three, particularly transponders, services, basic service particularly, and then most of the time we're going to spend looking at max penetration and Class D zone clearances. We will get to ATZ entry approvals, but we'll do that next week. There'll be a chance for any questions, and Chula is the person to send questions to via the Zoom chat, and he can stop me at an appropriate time. And we'll do some breakouts on the max penetration and the Class D zone clearance. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the transponders and secondary surveillance radar stuff. So this is not very many people have got one of these things. I don't know, 5 or 10% of gliders, something like that. But you need to know about it for the test. And if you've got one, it's very useful and you need to know how to use it. So this is a typical transponder, which is a trig, and you can see it. Let me just do this. You can see it here, and we've got the squawk code that we're sending. We've got our ID that we're sending as well, and that's our call sign, and the altitude in flight levels 04. And then here we've got some the control knob, which can go standby ground on or out. This is badly named because never put it on, always have it on out. Otherwise you don't send your altitude. We've got a button that we can press to get the VFR squawk, which is 7,000 as shown here. We've got a button that we can press to do an ident. So that's that lot. A GRP or wooden glider gives a very weak primary. I'm sorry about this. I'm using somebody else's thing. Let me just see if I can sort this out from him. There we go. I should do it. Right. So if you are in a glass or a wooden glider, you don't give much of a primary radar return. And the ground radar can't see what altitude you're at. If you've got a transponder, when the secondary surveillance radar paints you, you send back a signal which has some information in it. So it includes the flight level that you're at, and you'll manually set squawk code, so that's these two pieces of information. If you're using the squawk the controller gives you, it'll be some other number. But if you haven't got a controller, if you haven't had a squawk given to you by a controller, you can set the conspicuity code, and that's 7,000 when you're VFR and 2,000 when you're IFR, or 7,006 apparently in a TRA for gliders up in Scotland or one or two other places. The ident button you only press if you're asked to squawk ident, and that makes your signal flash on the radar screen so they can see exactly where you are. On the radar display, this is a picture from Heathrow, and they'll see something like this, which is a contact. A contact, and it's got your squawk and the flight level, as well as some other information. The RT language that we use is here. If they say squawk a number, it means set the code as you've been told. as I mentioned earlier, and this is important, unless you're told otherwise, you should always select altitude on. Otherwise, you're going along without showing what altitude you're at. A couple of examples: glider Charlie Delta Squawk 6201, to which the response will be Squawk 6201 glider Charlie Delta. Or you can say negative transponder glider Charlie Delta. They might say squawk code with altitude, which means you've got it wrong and you haven't selected altitude, in which case you select altitude. They might ask you to confirm your squawk, in which case you confirm the squawk set on the transponder. Reset the squawk, which means reset it, set it again. These things are pretty unusual with modern transponders. Squawk ident means press the ident button, and squawk standby would mean select the standby feature, which would stop you sending a squawk. Almost always, you just get told to squawk some code or squawk conspicuity. All right, let's have a look at basic service. Basic service. So what is it, where is it, and who? An ATSU can give pilots information useful for the safe and efficient conduct of flights. That's not very much, to be honest. It might include unsolicited traffic information, but don't bet on it. So they might tell you about some traffic. British controllers, they might or might not. If you're going through Cranfield, for example, on a basic service and they've got instrument traffic, they will tell you about it and they'll make some attempt to deconflict you. Perhaps more importantly, it gives the pilot a framework to tell busy nearby airfields about position and intended route. It helps the ATSU that doesn't have radar and any glider that's not squawking. They can give it to both VFR and IFR flights in Class G airspace, also to VFR flights in Class E airspace, and that's controlled airspace. It can be provided by air traffic control officers or flight information service officers, but not by air ground operators. And if possible, it's worth getting a service when you're passing near busy licensed airfields in Class G. It definitely aids situational awareness and it improves everybody's safety. Your obligations you're free to maneuver as you wish, unless you've agreed a specific limitation, so not above a given level, for coordination with other aircraft. You need to respond to any requests to report your position. You can reply your call sign position, possibly your time. We'll come to that. Your level, and possibly the next waypoint and the estimated time of arrival for that. You can tell the ATSU to stand by if you're busy, and you'll find that if you can, to apologise for this. If you can, a separate GPS screen to tell you where you are in relation to the person you're talking to can be quite useful. So I will set up on my nav system a screen that will tell me how far I am away and on what bearing from the airfield I'm talking to, and that means it's very easy for me to tell them where I am. You'll need to call either leaving the frequency or changing to another frequency station, and that's frequency before you go. And avoiding other traffic does remain your responsibility. They're not taking responsibility for that. London Information and Scottish Information can give you a basic service. Examiners might like you to do that in the test. It would be very unusual for a glider pilot to get a basic service from London Information. Indeed, if we all did, London Information would break. So we don't. But occasionally they can be useful if you want to clarify a NOTAM, or sometimes they might be able to provide a service that could be useful to you about a danger area or something like that. Some piece of information that you want to ask somebody about. London Information could do that for you. In Scotland, I believe that people do actually make use of Scottish information, particularly if they're flying in remote areas in the mountains. So it's a little bit different up there. And you can find, there's a coverage map that we've got here on this slide. You can see where the different frequencies and information services are with these references. One of the things that you need to be able to do if you're going to be able to do the test is this thing called a procedural position report. And the examiners on the call maybe can give us some more detail on this, but it is part of the test. And it's really a hangover from the days when people used to fly on airways procedurally. So they fly a route which went from one navigation beacon to another. And there's a format for giving a position report, which goes your call sign, where the last fix you were over, when you were there, what level you're at, the next fix, and when you expect to get there. So that's pretty useful if you're flying procedurally on an airway. It's not so useful as a glider pilot, but it's still in the test. For our usage, for in real life for glider pilots, when somebody asks you where you are, you can tell them where you are, your level, and what your next turning point is, and that's pretty useful. In the script we've given a couple of examples. So we've got report south of Beam when you're talking to Enston, and report north of Beam Oxford when you're talking to Oxford. So there's a couple of examples of a position report that you might be expected to do. And a beam, for those who don't know, means at when that feature is at right angles to your track and you're on the northern side or the southern side. If you're asked to do that, your response is Wilco. It's not a mandatory readback. And then at the next turning point, here's the call. So the call sign position, if it's the test, the time, the level, the next waypoint, and if it's the test, the ETA for that waypoint. You'll have to make up these numbers. Probably quite hard for a glider to give a decent ETA for the next waypoint. It depends on an awful lot of things. So there's one of the examples of how we do things a little differently in the test and real life.
Paul, I'm just going to interrupt a minute and just
basic service. The ATSU can say no. So they can deny your request for a basic service. It's pretty rare, though. Don't worry about it if it happens. You've made the offer and they're unable to do it. I've had it once, I think, from an ATSU who should have been able to give it, and they were really, really busy. So I didn't begrudge them as in the slightest. You just need to acknowledge Roger, leaving the frequency, and then you can go off, or you can stay on the frequency and listen to the chaos, which presumably is ensuing. If you ask, though, for a basic service from an air-ground communication service, they won't be able to give it to you. They will say unable.
Well, I'm just going to interrupt a minute and ask.
Okay, other flight information services, you need to know about these. They're less useful as a glider pilot. We've got a traffic service, which really requires a radar service. Well, it is a radar service. It requires the person you're talking to have radar and you to have a transponder, and they will tell you about traffic that might affect you. There's a deconfliction service which requires radar and transponder, and I think is IFR only. And they will not only tell you about the traffic, but they'll give you a course to miss the traffic and stay airborne.
Paul, can you hear me? Sorry to talk across you. Can you hear me?
Very unlikely to get that in busy airspace because it's just too full.
I can hear you.
There's a procedural service, which is when they don't have radar. It's for IFR traffic only, and it's based on your position reports based on the
Most of his volume turned down.
If you
sorry to talk across you, Paul.
Say Cranfield or Cambridge,
and the person annotating the screen, please stop.
Procedural service, and the separation is against other people flying on a procedural service and based on times to beacons and so on. And we've got some course slides, and there's a CAP, an air publication, CAA air publication, which gives you more information on that. If you ask for a traffic service without a transponder, you'll probably get a basic service anyway. And the service type is a mandatory read back. So if they say basic service, you repeat back basic service. Okay, so coaches, please make sure you've got a star in front of your name. Just as a reminder, this is the last reminder because Chula will be doing the breakout groups.
Paul, can you hear me at this point?
Right, let's have a little look at MATSs, military air traffic zones, not to be confused with air traffic zones. Okay, so military air traffic zones, or MATSs, are areas surrounding many military airfields, but they're the same class as the surrounding airspace. So if the surrounding airspace is Class G, they're Class G. In theory, civilian aircraft don't need a clearance to enter, or even an approval to enter. But it's good airmanship to request a MATS penetration. In theory, you do this, and this is a question you might get asked, so learn these numbers. In theory, do this at the earlier of, of 15 nautical miles or 5 minutes from the boundary. In practice, the gliders, we do it quite a lot later. 10 minutes before you get there is fine. And 10 minutes is unlikely to be as much as 15 nautical miles. It can take us half an hour to do 15 nautical miles, so that's a bit early to ask for MATS penetration. You'll get something like MATS penetration approved back, and that's not actually a clearance, but examiners do expect it to be read back. So although strictly, if you read the rules, it's not a read back. If you're doing the test, read it back. Don't forget that within the MATS are actual ATZs, and they do require entry approval for you to go in there because they're proper ATZs and you need approval to go in. If you're talking to a MATS controller, they're often busy talking on UHF radio to military aircraft, and you won't hear that. You might hear their end of it, but you might not. When you ask for MATS penetration, ask for basic service at the same time. So it's guided that request MATS penetration and basic service. And be ready to give position reports, including your level, as you go through the MATS. So let's have a look at Lakenheath. Where are we going to find the frequency? Well, might be in the radio or the nav system, can be on the reference card for the CAA. Here we go. Aerodrome Lakenheath radar approach 128.9, or it's on the 500,000 chart. There you go, combined MATS, which is the Mildenhall Lakenheath MATS 128.9, and it's in the AIP. So tune the radio, listen. You probably hear what the QNH is. Request basic service and MATS penetration, and before you leave the frequency, sign off. Tell them that you're leaving. A few practical tips for Lakenheath in particular. Lakenheath is staffed by American United States Air Force controllers. Their job is to control the F-15s, the F-22, and the F-31s, helicopters, tankers, and transport. And sometimes there are a lot of those. Andrew Watson and I went and visited them the other day, and it was very interesting to stand in the control room, which was very quiet with just a few bits of civilian traffic floating around. And then all of a sudden they sortied 25 jets in about as many minutes. And it got very, very busy indeed, and very noisy, interestingly, as well. They are radar controllers, and they're used to getting people with a transponder. So if you call them without a transponder, they're sort of a bit puzzled as to what to do with you. Often they don't stay on the base very long. They're in and out quite quickly. So it takes them a while to get used to how we do things, and then they're gone. They're often not very familiar with Cat 413. and they're talking to people on other frequencies. Strangely, for this particular place, the mats isn't very important to them. On the other hand, their climb outs and approaches are. So if you're flying around there, and this applies to pretty much anywhere where you fly, it's worth learning what they do and where they are busy. So at Lakenheath and Mildenhall, for example, there are one or two places where the fast jets all go in and out of, and then the big heavies go out in different places. So if you know that, it's easier to operate with them. These guys in particular aren't good at talking Cat 413. So you'll often get something different and it's worth being prepared. They might or might not give you a service. If they give you a basic service, it sounds awfully like a traffic service when you get it. It's much better to have a transponder with them. And sometimes with a transponder, I make an initial call and the response I get is radar contact MATS penetration approved. I haven't asked for MATS penetration. That I might not have asked for MATS penetration at that stage. They just come up with it. So you've got to be prepared to respond in a way that you might not otherwise expect. And if you don't have a transponder, the service you're going to get is much more limited, but we are working on that. It's quite interesting because we've actually persuaded them to get FLARM in their tower, and then we put a junior nationals comp straight past them, and they suddenly discovered 60 gliders just to their north, and they went, oh my God, this is terrible. That was why we went and had a meeting with them, because we were talking about procedures, that what they should do when there were 60 gliders trying to go past. And they've got airplanes that can climb quite quickly, so that's probably doable. Okay, let's have a talk about crossing Class D, which is actually quite similar, one or two minor changes. So, quick recap of Class D controlled airspace. Varying shapes, unlike a MATS, which tends to be one or two things of the same shape. And it surrounds many airports with commercial air transport. So Norwich, Bristol, Aberdeen, and Brize Norton, which is our example. You need a proper clearance to cross or enter a Class D zone. So you need to get the frequency from the radio, the frequency card, or the chart. You need to select a zone penetration or a zone crossing, request a zone penetration or a zone crossing 10 minutes before the boundary. There's a slight difference on the radio call in that you need to give the flight conditions you want the clearance for, either VFR or IFR. You'll need that for the test. If you forget it in real life, you're a glider, they're going to assume that you're VFR. There's no way they're going to give you an IFR clearance as a glider. If and when you get that clearance, you have to read the clearance back in full with your call sign on the end. And you can always ask the controller to say again if required. It sounds a bit scary, but it's actually not. My experience is controllers you're not going to go and do this in the Heathrow zone or Stansted, but if you want to cross Norwich or Brize or one of the Bristol most of the time, one of the places that aren't actually too busy, they're pretty accommodating, and they'll work with you to do something sensible. But give them a call in time. All right, a little bit more on that. You can ask for IFR, VFR, or special VFR clearance. So in theory, but to some degree we're talking test here, because as I say, the glider pilot would not ask for an IFR clearance, I don't think. It imposes quite a big load on the controller to have you IFR, because he's got to give you separation from other IFR traffic. If you're VFR, you have to remain 1,000 feet vertically or 1,500 meters horizontally from cloud when above 3,000 feet. Above mean sea level or 1,000 feet above ground. So that is as I'm sure you know from your bronze course, that is the strict definition of VFR. We all, of course, obey that rule. There is something called special VFR, And if you get a special VFR clearance, you need to be inside of the surface and clear of the cloud. And that can be useful. On the other hand, I think it gives more significant separation requirements to the controller. So probably you're going to want on a good gliding day, you're going to want a VFR crossing of one of these zones. When you enter the zone, you're going to be put under radar control. That's the equivalent of basic service or traffic service outside controlled airspace. But those other services we were talking about are all outside controlled airspace. And now we are inside controlled airspace. And that's a radar control service. The controller is only guaranteeing IFR, IFR, and IFR SVFR separation. They're not guaranteeing U separation as a VFR contact, although they're going to pay a lot of attention to that in reality. So the responsibility for separation still is yours. You'll get assistance from them. And if they let a glider through, it's probably because there's nothing in your way. A little bit more. We've got into CAP 413 and the equivalent air traffic control stuff. The idea that if we're a glider, and we're demonstrating that by our call sign of glider, there's an expectation that we can deviate up to sort of a couple of nautical miles from track, or we might stop to thermal unless we're told otherwise. So you don't need to ask to do that. They'll have assigned a block of airspace to you, and you can fly normally within that. If you're going to do anything dramatically different, I'd talk to them. You might get an altitude restriction or request or a lateral limitation. For example, not above altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1020, or remain east of the ATZ, or not below height 3,000 feet, airfield QFE 908 hectopascals. And they are part of your clearance, so you need to obey them. Now, we are in a glider, and sometimes it might be, if it's a knot below, that at some point you're going to go, oh, I can't do this. I am still descending unexpectedly, and I'm going to bust it. In which case, tell them as soon as you know. And generally, I'll give them a decent amount of warning and say, unlikely to be able to comply. And then I'll tell them when I actually go through the limit. But I'd be cautious about accepting a clearance that I thought was a moderate possibility I couldn't comply with. Okay, so breakouts. We've got two examples to look at, Lakenheath and Bryce. At Lakenheath, we want you to get a max penetration. You can do it from various different positions. So you're trying to use the framework and put different information in. And for Bryce, get a Class D crossing clearance. Coaches, if you feel up to it, you can just run the examples we've given. That's fine. But if you get the chance and you fancy it, you could try a few different combinations of having a transponder, of the glider having a transponder or no transponder. You could throw in a few other requests or information, traffic or QNH. I've put two maps on the course materials website under part 3 for you to use, one of Lakenheath, one of Bryce. If you open those in new tabs on your PC and share that screen, you can zoom into that quite easily using control scroll and so on. For next time, our next session is after Christmas. We have a few weeks of a break, so Tuesday, January the 9th. And you need to look at the part 4 course materials, the TMG flight. And we'll be looking at ATZ entry and landing during that stage. So the TMG flight is where we introduce some of the stuff that's in the FRTOL exam that you might not commonly use as a glider pilot, so taxiing and taking off and so on. Excuse me. But it's interesting, and it actually helps you understand what other people are doing as they go past. ATZ entry and landing, which we will have a good look at, is pretty important to a glider pilot because quite often that's what we do. All right, if you've got any further questions, you can throw them to Shula. Sorry.
Paul,
So people have been saying Shula's trying to get your attention. I've missed it. I'm sorry about that.
Paul, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, just pause 1 second. Everyone else who's giving me sort of radio checks through that, thank you for your help there. Paul, could you address this question? What does north of beam mean?
Yes, in a moment. Let me finish this slide, and then I'll stop screen sharing, and then we can go.
Okay.
So further questions can go on the on the chat, or send me an email, and I will deal with them. Okay, good. Let me kill this, and then right. Sorry about that, guys. I picked up that presentation from last time, and it was I think it was somebody else's, not mine, and it kept moving forward on me. Should have checked it. Should have tried to run it. Okay, anyway, so what does north of beam mean? North of beam means we're going to be heading on the north side of the airfield, and north of beam is when, as we go along our track, the airfield is perpendicular to us. So if we're heading northeast, we will be northwest of the airfield when we are north of beam. Does that make sense to everybody?
Paul, I hate to say this, but I thought we had a big debate about this last year and polled around the controllers and decided that wasn't what it meant. You were north of beam when you're due north.
We did have a big debate, and I did check into it afterwards, and I think that was about the 2-to-1 majority thing that I've just told you. Eventually, it's not a great for the reason that Andrew says that. By about 2-to-1, and I think it's the way around I just said, but I could have it wrong. By about 2-to-1, there is a dispute about what north of beam means. So hopefully they won't ask you, but that's the one I'd use. Other people might use something different. What else have we got, Chile?
Okay, so stand by one, please.
Sorry, say again?
Yeah, in my experience, MATS controllers will ask you to set QFE rather than QNH. So all I'll say, it's a good point. So just be alert, especially alert when you're talking to MATS, because they might very well ask you to set QFE. That's a good point. Thank you. I'll move on.
Yeah, can I comment on that? It depends. Lakenheath, Mildenhall, absolutely QNH. They have no idea what QFE is. Places like Bryce, they'll generally give, Bryce will give you QNH. Benson, generally it's QNH, unless you go over the top of the ATZ, in which case you might get a QFE. And the other thing you'll get from military controllers is the regional pressure setting, which is different from the QNH, and you need to understand how and why. I'm not going to go into it now. But you might get a regional QNH. So I'll say something like Cotswold is the Cotswold 909 and 8 hectopascals, or the Wessex 907, and it's different from the airfield QNH.
Okay, you can take this one as well, Paul, if you like. Does special VFR allow you to climb to cloud base? If not, what's the difference between it and VFR?
So does special VFR what?
Allow you to climb to cloud base?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so special VFR is available in control zones, not control areas, I think, and it is clear of cloud and in sight of the ground, and there's a minimum visibility, which I can't remember. Okay.
Next one from Melissa. If I'm told about traffic and I respond not seen, I think the right term is not sighted. It's either in sight or not sighted. That's worth remembering. Do I need to tell them when I eventually see it? I would say only as appropriate. Use your judgment.
Yes, I think. Yeah, for the exam, the phraseology is just as Chula has described. If the controller seems to be worried about the traffic and he's they've told you about it more than once because they think it's an actual conflict with you. You'll get it they'll start quite a long way out if you're getting a traffic service. It might be 3 or 4 miles. You can't see it at 3 or 4 miles. If they keep telling you about it, that means that they are worried that you and it are getting quite close. So yes, tell them when you've seen it. If it's 3 miles away passing down one side, I wouldn't bother. So as Tudor says, as appropriate.
There are 2 here about the website, really. I'll give you them both, Paul. Is there a script on the website? I've had a look, can't find it. Next one is, I've installed the script rehearser, but where do I find the material and get it to work?
So under the course materials on the website, in part 1, there is a link to a folder with all the scripts in it. And then I think for each other part, if you just read what's the text on that page, you'll find a link to the particular script for the example.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was reading. Did you mention the script rehearser? You did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Matthew, how many controller types give a traffic service? So that's only going to be from and not from air traffic control.
Yeah.
Reading as I go for Lakenheath, Mildenhall, combined mats, how do you speak to Lakenheath versus Mildenhall? My experience of going through there, yours call Lakenheath.
So that's an example of a combined mats.
Yep.
A combined mats is one chunk of airspace which has more than one airfield in it. There's another big one in the middle of the country, which is Waddington and Scampton and all those, Cranfield and so on. And they have, if you look at the chart I showed, it had a CMATS frequency, 128.9, and that's Lakenheath radar, and they control the whole thing. So they have a single approach service which deals with both those airfields, and that's who you talk to. You won't individually talk to Mildenhall or Lakenheath unless you got so close that they pushed you over to one of their tower frequencies, and that's unusual because they try very hard to keep you out of those ATZs.
Last question coming from Anthony. When leaving a frequency, when would you request as opposed to telling them? So my simple rule for this is if I'm talking to air traffic control, I request. I don't think there's really any law about this. You could just tell them. But if you're talking about air traffic control, it's just they kind of expect you to ask. And if it's AFIS or air ground, then I tell them I'm leaving the frequency.
Yeah, that works. I think if I wanted to say something which is a bit more specific, if I'm on a basic service, I can either request or tell. If I'm in controlled airspace, they have to tell me to do it. You can't arbitrarily leave a frequency inside controlled airspace. But in Class G on a basic service, you could just say I'm going if you wanted to. But it's polite to ask.
Yeah. Okay, that's the questions. 19 groups, Paul.